how does a nation truly become free? I mean, is it always about a single day, flag raising, declared independence? Or can it be something much longer, way more complex, maybe even multiple journeys happening over time? And when we talk about freedom or azadi, is it always throwing off some external power, or can it be, an internal thing, a transformation?
That's a really, really good question to kick things off. And it's perfect for our deep dive today. We're going to get into the frankly fascinating and intricate paths to what we call independence or azadi for two really significant nations, Iran and Israel. You've shared some fantastic source material, and our mission here is to unpack those key moments, maybe some surprising facts and those aha insights, the things that
Yeah.
really define their unique stories. And what you'll see is that understanding their past, how they conceived of and achieved their self-determination, it's absolutely crucial for understanding where they are now.
Right. And what's really striking, as we'll see, is just how incredibly different these paths were. For Iran, it's not like, say, India or the US with a clear date where they kicked out a colonial power. It's much more layered, isn't it? Full of internal struggles, shifts in identity.
Exactly.
And then Israel, well, that's a story rooted in this ancient dream, a spiritual thing almost, but then made real in modern times through just incredible struggle, massive global events, politics.
Precisely. And these aren't just, dusty history lessons. These journeys, deeply personal for the people involved and loaded with historical weight,
Yeah.
they didn't just shape these nations internally. They fundamentally shaped their relationship with each other and their place in the wider world. It leads directly to the complex situation we see today. So we'll trace their distinct journeys piece by piece and then see how these seemingly separate stories actually intersected in a really profound and honestly game-changing way.
Okay, let's dive in then, starting with Iran. When we talk about Iran's Azadi, its path to freedom, it's pretty unique. I mean, this is an ancient civilization, right? Thousands of years of history. So its idea of Azadi isn't really about getting free from an outside colonizer on a specific date, like you said, not like India from Britain. Our sources really point to its modern Azadi story having, well, almost two major parts, like two distinct births, maybe.
That's a critical point. Iran's sheer antiquity means it has this continuous sense of self, of nationhood that predates a lot of modern ideas about states.
Yeah.
So its freedom story is less about gaining sovereignty from an occupier because, well, they mostly saw themselves as sovereign anyway, even when influenced, and more about these deep internal shifts. It's about asserting its own path, its own identity against internal weaknesses and those external forces trying to, pull the strings.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's look at that first birth then. Our sources seem to place it around 1925 with the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty. This is framed as sort of freedom from the old system. What was going on in Iran or Persia then, leading up to this? What was the backdrop?
Context is fascinating and a bit grim, actually. Turn of the 20th century, early 1900s. Persia, as it was still mostly known internationally, was in a really weak spot. Nominally, you had the Qajar dynasty ruling, but they were, let's be honest, pretty ineffective, corrupt by this point. In reality, the country was basically a playground for the British and Russian empires.
Right.
They weren't just exploiting it economically like with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company
Right, the oil.
and strategically carving out these spheres of influence, but they were doing it almost openly. Britain controlled the South and the oil. Russia dominated the North. Internally, the country was fragmented, pretty backward in terms of infrastructure and central control.
So it sounds like the situation was unstable, ripe for a big internal change, even if not a classic anti-colonial revolution. And that change did come quite suddenly in 1921. Our sources point to this military coup led by a really strong figure, Reza Khan, who is a military commander, right? Led the Persian Cossack Brigade.
That's him, a very ambitious, very capable military man.
And he just marches into Tehran and takes control of the government, an internal power shift, a strongman stepping into a vacuum.
Exactly. And that coup in 21 was really just the first step. It showed the weakness of the Qajars. 4 years later, in 1925, Reza Khan makes the big move. He completely abolishes the Qajar dynasty, gets the parliament, the Majlis, to formally depose the last Qajar Shah. And then he declares himself the new Shah, the king of Iran. Kicking off the Pahlavi dynasty, this wasn't just swapping one ruler for another, it was a fundamental change. He saw himself as the guy who would build a new, strong, modern Iran, sort of like Ataturk was doing in Turkey around the same time.
Okay, so 1925 marks this first kind of azadi, this first birth. What kind of freedom was this exactly? From an Iranian point of view, our sources suggest it was mainly internal freedom, freedom from Iran's own old, weak, corrupt system. Consolidation, centralization. But was it seen as azadi by ordinary people or just one elite replacing another?
That's a good question, and it's probably mixed. I mean, for many, especially nationalists and modernizers, it was seen as a step towards reclaiming national dignity.
Yeah.
Reza Shah's main aim was definitely to centralize power, and crucially, to push back hard against that British and Russian dominance that had crippled the country. He wanted a strong, modern Iran that could stand on its own feet, make its own decisions, not be a pawn. Which raises that classic question, right? How does a nation assert itself when it's fragmented and under pressure? His answer was top-down strength and modernization, even if it was authoritarian.
And he definitely put down some concrete foundations, things we still see today. The sources mention the name change, right? From Persia to Iran in 1935. That's a big symbolic shift, connecting to ancient roots but looking forward. A modern army was built, replacing tribal militias, big infrastructure projects, universities like the University of Tehran, industries, and that huge railway project, the Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting north and south.
Yeah, connecting the Caspian to the Persian Gulf. Hugely ambitious.
These were all fundamental pieces for building a modern nation state.
Absolutely. So 1925, you can definitely see it as a first Azadi, or maybe the birth of modern Iran. It's the moment the country really starts trying to grab its own destiny, moving away from being this decentralized, externally manipulated place. It was kind of an internal revolution imposed from the top down,
Right.
which, laid the groundwork for later changes, but also sowed some seeds of future problems because of how authoritarian it was.
And speaking of future problems and changes, that brings us straight to the second and arguably even more defining moment in Iran's Azadi story, the Islamic Revolution of 1979. I mean, this event is massive. It fundamentally created the Iran we see today, and it's widely seen as Iran's real Azadi, freedom from Western influence and freedom from the monarchy itself. So what led to this huge upheaval after decades of Pahlavi rule?
Well, it's fascinating because the roots of the 79 revolution were really growing during the reign of Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He took over during World War II when the Allies forced his father to abdicate. He continued the modernization, the westernization, but his rule became deeply problematic for huge parts of Iranian society. One of the biggest drivers, maybe the biggest, was this powerful gut-level feeling that the Shah was completely controlled by the United States.
Right, the American puppet idea.
Exactly. And it wasn't just paranoia. You had the 1953 coup where the CIA and MI6 helped overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry and put the Shah back in absolute power. That event burned itself into the national consciousness. It created this deep suspicion that major decisions weren't being made in Tehran, but in Washington. It felt like a continuation of foreign meddling, just a different power this time. And that alienated everyone, religious figures, nationalists, intellectuals.
And that feeling of being controlled from outside was made worse by what was happening inside Iran, the repression. Our sources talk a lot about Savak, the Shah's secret police. They sound terrifying.
They were. Savak was notorious. Widespread surveillance, arbitrary arrests, systematic torture, disappearances, killings. Anyone who spoke out against the Shah risked facing them. It created this intense climate of fear. You couldn't really express dissent openly. It just bottled everything up, creating this massive resentment under the surface. And then you had the Shah's big modernization project, the White Revolution he launched in the 60s. On paper, some parts looked progressive: land reform, literacy campaigns, even expanding women's rights, like the right to vote. But it was all imposed from the top down, very rapidly and very much along Western lines. It promoted Western culture, dress, social norms.
Which clashed massively with traditional values.
Massively. For conservative and religious Iranians, many of whom were the majority, it felt like a direct attack on their culture, their identity, their Islamic values. Land reform angered landowners and the powerful clergy who lost land. Secularization of education and law angered the religious establishment. It created this deep cultural divide in the country. Modernizers versus traditionalists.
And then there was the money issue. Iran was making billions from oil, especially after the price hikes in the 70s. But where was it going? Our sources point to huge inequality.
That's right. The wealth was incredibly concentrated. The Shah's inner circle, the elite connected to the palace, the westernized upper class in Tehran, they benefited enormously. There was corruption, ostentatious wealth. Meanwhile, much of the rural population, the urban poor, the traditional merchants in the bazaars, they felt left behind. They faced inflation, lack of opportunity. It bred this powerful sense of injustice. The nation's wealth wasn't benefiting the nation, just a select few.
So you have this potent mix: perceived foreign control, brutal repression, cultural clashes, economic inequality. It sounds explosive. Who tapped into all this discontent?
This is where Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini becomes central. He was a highly respected Shia cleric, a marja, who'd been a vocal opponent of the Shah's policies for years, especially the secularization and the close ties to the U.S. and Israel. He'd been exiled by the Shah back in the 60s, first to Turkey, then Iraq, and finally to France. But even from exile, his message got through.
Hows?
Cassette tapes. His sermons and political speeches condemning the Shah, calling for an Islamic government, were recorded on simple cassette tapes. These tapes were smuggled into Iran, copied, and passed around secretly through networks of mosques, students, bazaris. It was an underground media revolution. Khomeini's voice, his charisma, his clear anti-imperialist and Islamic message resonated incredibly powerfully with millions who felt alienated and oppressed. He gave them a leader, an ideology, and a vision for a different kind of Azadi.
Wow, cassette tapes fueling a revolution. So how did it actually ignite? All this pressure builds up.
It really exploded in 1978. What started as smaller protests, often sparked by government actions against religious figures or critical articles, just grew and grew.
Millions took to the streets across Iran, not just in Tehran, everywhere. Students, workers, merchants, religious groups. It became a massive nationwide uprising.
The regime responded with force, famously. The Black Friday massacre in September 78 in Tehran's Jealous Square, where troops fired on protesters, killing many. But instead of crushing the movement, it just fueled the anger and determination.
And the Shah, what could he do?
By late 1978, early 1979, the situation was spiraling out of his control. The military was wavering, strikes were paralyzing the country, his U.S. backers were getting nervous and sending mixed signals. He appointed a civilian prime minister, tried concessions, but it was too little, too late. The demand was clear. The Shah must go. So on January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fled Iran. He said he was going on holiday, but everyone knew he wasn't coming back. His departure effectively signaled the end of the monarchy.
And that cleared the path for Khomeini's return. That must have been an incredible moment.
Absolutely iconic. February 1st, 1979. After 14 years in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini flies back to Tehran. And the reception. Our sources described literally millions of people flooding the streets, lining the route from the airport. An unbelievable outpouring of support. It was clear who now held the momentum and the popular legitimacy.
And things moved fast after that.
Incredibly fast. The next 10 days are known as the 10 Days of Dawn. Khomeini appointed his own provisional government. There were clashes between revolutionaries and remaining loyalist forces, but the military leadership eventually declared neutrality, basically collapsing the Shah's regime. The Shah's appointed prime minister resigned. Revolutionary committees, the Comitas, took control on the ground. The old order just crumbled.
And then the formal declaration.
Yes. A referendum was held at the end of March 1979. The question was simple. Do you want an Islamic Republic? The result was a landslide. Over 98% voted yes. So on April 1st, 1979, Iran was officially declared an Islamic Republic. This wasn't just a new government, it was a whole new system, based on Khomeini's concept of Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, a fundamental break with the past.
So this true Azadi of 1979, what did it really mean?
First, it meant the end of monarchy. A 2,500-year-old tradition of kingship in Persia and Iran, gone. Just like that. That's monumental in historical terms. Second, it was a massive rejection of Western, particularly American, influence. This is when you see slogans like "Death to America" become prominent. Iran pulled out of alliances like CENTO, adopted a fiercely independent, non-aligned foreign policy. Neither East nor West was the motto. And it became a champion of the Palestinian cause, positioning itself against Israel.
Which was a huge shift, because under the Shah, Iran and Israel had actually had pretty close, if quiet, relations, right?
Exactly. That's a crucial point we'll come back to. The Shahs, Iran, and Israel had cooperated on security, intelligence, even oil. The revolution completely flipped that script. Israel went from a strategic partner to the little Satan, an illegitimate entity in the eyes of the new regime. And thirdly, this Azadi meant embracing a new identity. Not Western secularism, not monarchy, but an identity deeply rooted in Shia Islam and the idea that religious leaders should guide the state. It created this unique theocratic republic.
Okay, so summing up Iran. Its Azadi wasn't really about freedom from a foreign colonizer in the traditional sense. It was more internal. 1925 was about freedom from the weak Qajar system, building a modern, centralized state, but under an authoritarian Shah. Then 1979 was freedom from that Shah, seen as a U.S. puppet, and freedom from monarchy itself, leading to the Islamic Republic. And this 1979 moment dramatically changed its relationship with the world, including Israel.
Perfectly put. It was about internal transformation and reclaiming destiny from both internal decay and perceived external control. Now let's pivot to Israel, and you'll see immediately it's a completely different kind of story.
Right. Israel is a new country born mid-20th century. Its Azadi wasn't an internal revolution against its own system. It was the culmination of a long process, ancient dreams, modern politics, global events.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The foundation stone, really, is the idea of Zionism, which
Oh.
emerges strongly in the late 19th century. This was happening against a backdrop of intense anti-Semitism in Europe, pogroms in Russia, the Dreyfus Affair in France showing Jews couldn't even rely on supposedly enlightened nations for safety. So the idea crystallizes. The only real solution for Jewish security and self-determination is to have their own country. Because for nearly 2,000 years since the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, Jews have been scattered across the globe, mostly living as minorities, often facing persecution.
So Zionism was the political movement to create this state.
Yes, political Zionism, most famously articulated as the Theodor Herzl, he organized the first Zionist Congress in 1897. The goal was to establish a Jewish national home.
And not just any home, there was a specific place in mind, wasn't there, tied to ancient history and religion.
Deeply tied. Jewish religious texts, prayers, cultural memory all spoke of the Promised Land, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, also called Zion, which is, geographically, the region where modern Israel is located. So Zionism wasn't just about finding a territory. It was specifically about returning to this ancestral homeland, reclaiming that ancient connection.
Okay, so you have this idea, this movement building steam. What was the first big breakthrough on the world stage?
That came during World War I, a pivotal moment. On November 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. This was a formal statement, a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It declared British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, Palestine at the time was still part of the Ottoman Empire, which Britain was fighting against.
Why did Britain do that? What was in it for them?
A mix of reasons, according to our sources. Partly, they hoped to gain support for the war effort from Jews in allied countries like the U.S. and Russia. Partly, it was about post-war calculations they wanted influence in the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire collapsed, especially near the Suez Canal. But the impact was huge. It took Zionism from being a dream, an ideology, and gave it the backing of a major world power. It made a Jewish state seem politically possible. Though, crucially, it also included that phrase about not prejudicing the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, which immediately highlighted the conflict inherent in the plan.
Right, so after WWI, the Ottoman Empire is gone, and Britain takes control of Palestine. This is the Mandate period.
Exactly. The League of Nations formally granted Britain the mandate for Palestine starting around 1920. Britain's job was supposedly to govern the territory and prepare it for self-rule, while also implementing the Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish national home, a very difficult balancing act.
And during this Mandate period, that's when Jewish immigration really ramps up.
Massively, especially with rising anti-Semitism in Europe in the 20s and 30s. Hundreds of thousands of Jews made Aliyah the Hebrew term for immigrating to the land of Israel. They bought land, often from absentee Arab landowners. They established agricultural settlements, the famous kibbutzim and moshevim, draining swamps, cultivating land. They built new towns and cities, most notably Tel Aviv, which grew rapidly. And they set up institutions. The Jewish Agency acted like a quasi-government. The Histadrut was a powerful labor federation. They were building the infrastructure of a state in waiting.
But this huge influx must have caused friction with the existing Arab population.
Huge friction. This is really where the core conflict takes shape on the ground. The Palestinian Arab population, who were the majority, saw this wave of immigration and land purchase as a direct threat. They felt they were losing their country, their land, their rights. This led to growing resentment, protests, riots, and eventually a major uprising, the Arab Revolt of 1936-1939, against both British rule and Zionist settlement. The tension was becoming unbearable.
Then comes World War II and the Holocaust, an event so horrific it's hard to even comprehend.
The systematic industrialized murder of 6 million European Jews by Nazi Germany. It utterly devastated Jewish life in Europe, and the impact on the quest for a Jewish state was profound.
How so?
Well, first, it created overwhelming international sympathy. The world saw the catastrophic consequences of Jewish powerlessness, of not having a place of refuge. The argument for a safe haven, a sovereign state where Jews could defend themselves, became incredibly compelling, almost morally undeniable for many in the international community. Never again became the watchword. And second, for the hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors, many languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe, Palestine seemed like the only viable option, the last hope. The pressure to allow them entry intensified dramatically.
So after WWII, the situation in Palestine is explosive. Britain can't handle it anymore.
Not really. They were exhausted from the war, facing escalating violence from both Jewish underground groups fighting against British restrictions on immigration and from Arab opposition. So in 1947, Britain essentially washed its hands of the problem and handed it over to the newly formed United Nations. Let the world decide.
And the UN came up with a plan?
They did. After investigation by a special committee, the UN General Assembly proposed Resolution 181 on November 29, 1947. This was the famous partition plan. It recommended dividing Mandate Palestine into two independent states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. The city of Jerusalem, holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, was to be placed under a special international regime.
How was that received?
Critically different reactions. The Jewish Agency, representing the Jewish community in Palestine, accepted the plan. It wasn't perfect from their perspective. They didn't get all the land they wanted. Jerusalem was internationalized, but it offered statehood. It was a historic compromise they were willing to take. However, the Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected it entirely, vehemently.
Why the rejection?
Their view was that the UN had no right to partition their homeland, that the Jewish immigrants were newcomers, and that establishing a Jewish state on any part of Palestine was fundamentally unjust to the existing Arab majority. They argued for a single Arab majority state in all of Palestine. This fundamental disagreement meant the UN plan, designed to solve the conflict, actually guaranteed war.
So violence escalates immediately after the UN vote.
Yes. It essentially turned into a civil war between the Jewish and Arab communities within Palestine. Militias clashed, attacks increased. Britain announced it would end its mandate and withdraw its troops by May 15, 1948. Everyone knew a power vacuum was coming, and both sides prepared for a larger conflict. And then came the moment, May 14, 1948. Just hours before the British mandate expired at midnight, Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, gathered in the Tel Aviv Museum.
And Ben-Gurion declares independence.
He does. He reads out the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. It proclaims a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel, a hugely courageous act, given that they knew invasion was imminent. It was the culmination of 50 years of political Zionism, 2,000 years of yearning, and the immediate response to the Holocaust and the end of the mandate.
And recognition came quickly.
Very quickly. President Truman recognized Israel on behalf of the United States just minutes later. The Soviet Union also recognized Israel soon after. That immediate recognition, especially from the U.S., was crucial diplomatically.
But independence wasn't peaceful. It was born in war, as you said.
Literally the next day, May 15, 1948, as the last British troops left, armies from 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, then Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded Israel. Their aim was to crush the new state and support the Palestinian Arabs. This is the start of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or what Israelis call the War of Independence.
And against the odds, Israel survived.
It did. It was a desperate, brutal war. Many observers didn't expect the new, poorly equipped Israeli forces to withstand the combined Arab armies, but they fought fiercely, were well-organized, highly motivated, and eventually managed to turn the tide. They not only defended the territory allotted by the UN plan, but actually expanded it in some areas. But this victory came at a terrible human cost, particularly for the Palestinians. During the fighting and its aftermath, somewhere around 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes in the areas that became Israel.
This is the Nakba.
Yes, for Palestinians, this mass displacement is the Nakba, the catastrophe. They became refugees in neighboring Arab countries in the West Bank and Gaza. And this issue of the Palestinian refugees, their right of return, remains one of the absolute core, unresolved issues of the entire conflict, fueling it to this day.
So, wrapping up Israel's path, Azadi on May 14th, 1948 was the endpoint of a long journey.
Exactly. It was the product of the Zionist dream going back decades, Britain's Balfour Declaration giving it political legs, the global shock and sympathy after the Holocaust creating urgency, the UN providing a legal framework, however it contested, Ben-Gurion's bold declaration making it real, and finally, winning that immediate war for survival, which tragically also created the Palestinian refugee crisis. A complex birth indeed.
Okay, let's try and connect these threads now. We've laid out these two incredibly different stories of achieving Azadi. Iran's journey, mostly internal, evolving from fixing its own weak system to a revolution against perceived foreign control in its own monarchy. Israel's journey, realizing ancient dream through global events, international diplomacy, immigration, and finally, war. What really stands out when you put them side by side like this?
The contrast in relation to the outside world is stark, isn't it? Iran's 1979 Azadi was fundamentally about rejecting external influence, particularly American influence, and radically changing its internal system based on its own interpretation of its identity, which was now Islamic. Israel's Azadi, on the other hand, while driven by an internal Jewish national movement, was heavily reliant on external factors. British support initially, international sympathy post-Holocaust, UN legitimization, and ultimately its ability to defend itself against external attack. Iran sought freedom from foreign powers. Israel, in many ways, needed recognition and support from foreign powers to come into existence and survive. Their definitions and experiences of achieving freedom were shaped in almost opposite ways by the international context.
And this leads right back to that crucial point you made earlier. Iran's 1979 revolution, its specific form of Azadi, directly led to the hostility with Israel.
Precisely. Our sources underline this. Under the Shah, Iran and Israel were maybe not public friends, but definitely strategic partners against shared Arab adversaries and Soviet influence. They cooperated.
Oil, security, intelligence.
All of that. But the Islamic Revolution redefined Iran's identity and its foreign policy. The Shah's alliance with Israel became proof, in the eyes of the revolutionaries, of his betrayal and subservience to the U.S., the great Satan. Israel became the little Satan, an illegitimate state, an outpost of American imperialism, and an oppressor of the Palestinians, whose cause the Islamic Republic passionately adopted. So that very act of Iran achieving its revolutionary Azadi in 1979 instantly turned a former ally into a fundamental enemy. It completely reshaped the strategic map of the Middle East.
So for you listening, thinking about today's headlines, today's conflicts, understanding these very different historical paths to freedom or Azadi isn't just history, it's absolutely vital context.
Right, these aren't just footnotes. There are living histories that continue to shape national identities, political decisions, regional alliances, and deep-seated animosities. Why Iran acts the way it does, why Israel acts the way it does, why their relationship is what it is, so much of it traces back to these foundational yet starkly contrasting independence narratives.
It makes you think, doesn't it? If Azadi, if freedom can be so different, so layered, so rooted in specific histories and cultures, what does that tell us about how we understand conflicts and alliances everywhere? How much are we missing if we just see the surface?
That's the perfect thought to leave with. We really encourage you to keep digging into these histories. Maybe look at other countries. How did they define and achieve their independence? Were there multiple stages, internal factors versus external? It's often far more complex and far more interesting than a single date on a calendar.